So we've been in a series, if you're just joining us, either online or in person here, we've been working through a letter in the New Testament of the Bible called 1 Corinthians. It's Paul, who's a central kind of missionary figure, taking the message of Jesus beyond Israel, out into the Roman Empire, to various cities and places. And he started a church community, a group of Jesus followers in ancient Greece, in a city of Corinth. And Paul's writing them because they've been communicating back and forth. And they've had some concerns and some questions, and so Paul is just speaking into their comments and giving them some advice in this portion of the letter. But kind of the overview is it's a culture that's saturated with the desire for honor, being exalted above other people, competing, getting ahead. Maybe some of those things sound familiar in our culture today. But that's really dominating the way the Corinthians see life. And Paul's saying, when you look at the person of Jesus Christ, you see an ultimate picture of humility that utterly transforms the way that you look at and treat other people. And so what would it look like to live life not trying to pursue everything your culture is pushing, all this desire for honor and self-exaltation, but what would it look like when you're living completely differently, pursuing humility in the midst of a culture that's all about honor? Very different, and it gets very uncomfortable at times. We've been in a section the last couple of weeks, chapters 8, 9, and 10, that focus more on kind of that difficult decision in life where you have to choose whether or not to live freely in certain instances or whether or not to set aside your freedoms and rights, which again feels very un-American in our culture today. To set down our rights and what we deserve for the good of anyone else almost seems culturally foreign. But Paul's saying that's another way that we live like Jesus. So over time, as we encounter God in the Bible, we discover that he gives people a certain, sometimes uncomfortable amount of freedom to weigh his wisdom, make different choices, and ultimately answer to him instead of just to other human beings. We talked about this last week as well. And because of that, it's really important that we make time to get to know each other well and to ask each other about each other's comfort zones and personal convictions, which are firmly held beliefs and opinions, and we all have them, in order that we can love each other well. And we do this either by allowing other people to exercise freedoms that we wouldn't exercise ourselves without being judgmental of their actions, of their motives. And we also do it by setting aside our freedoms on certain occasions when we think they might cause another follower of Jesus to feel confused or distressed or tempted. Sometimes we refuse our rights, and we talked about some ways we could do this last week, by avoiding certain places or certain foods or certain drinks or certain forms of entertainment or certain types of relationships. Sometimes we set those things aside, or sometimes we just volunteer our time instead of charging for it or our services. And we do those things because we know that doing that will help us either avoid previous struggles we've had, achieve our personal goals. It's the reason why Paul set aside some of his rights, or to just assist someone else for free instead of for charge. Sometimes, too, though, we choose to exercise our rights and freedoms. We don't set them aside. And we do this either just to enjoy life, because that's okay, to share experiences with people who have similar convictions, similar opinions about what is wise and unwise or good and bad, or even to demonstrate sometimes that categories of food and drinks, or styles of clothes and music, or expressions of emotion and affection don't make us more or less pleasing to God. If you look at Scripture, you quickly learn that God is more focused on his followers' hearts and hands. Are we being kind to people? Are we being generous? Are we being impartial? Are we humble? Are we loyal people? Are we working to alleviate injustices in our world? Are we working through relationship conflicts, even though it's hard? Are we cultivating environments where life can thrive, either in our ecosystems around us or in our relationships around us? Because sometimes we get the picture, I think, that God's up in heaven and he's just scrutinizing us. He's criticizing our clothes. What does God think today? Or he's criticizing our cocktails or our cups of coffee or the other things in life, and he's just so focused on those things. But in reality, he's urging us to focus on those more important matters of how we're treating other people. What are our hearts like? What are our hands involved with in the bigger picture? And so we're finishing that conversation this morning by looking through chapter 10. And I titled this Reading the Room, because this is really Paul summarizing his thoughts and saying we all find ourselves in different circumstances around people, and we have to make decisions in the moment about what we're going to do or what we're not going to do. And so in the moment where we're trying to figure things out, especially in the areas of, how free can I be in the circumstance, or maybe how restricted should I be in this circumstance because of the people who are around me, like how do I make those decisions in the moment? And as we get into this, first of all, I want to give us 3 Bible words and phrases that we're going to encounter this morning that for some of you might be unfamiliar or less familiar. For others of you, if you've been in the Bible for a while or churches, maybe you have a good handle on that. But here at our church, we have people who are very new to Christianity or exploring it, and people who have been believers in Jesus and followers of him for decades, 40, 50 years, and everything in between. So we want to kind of address those unfamiliar things before we kick things off today. The first word that you're going to come across is baptism. And at its very basic, without going into a lot of detail, baptism is going into water as an expression of devotion to a belief system or to a particular leader. That's what that is. We also encounter a phrase called the end of the ages or end of the ages. You'll see that some places in the Bible. What is that talking about? It's really talking about, think of ends as like bookends, okay, on the shelf of history. And so this is a bookend of history, a time period predicted throughout the Bible when God himself will begin setting the world right. So history has progressed throughout all these books, historical books you might say, and then there's going to come a bookend where God steps in and he starts to take this world that's gone awry and been very focused on what humanity wants to do with it, and he's going to start to set things right and restore his original intention to that. And in the Bible, that kind of begins with Jesus, but it's something that's continuing even until this point, and it hasn't been finished yet. Because if you look around you, the world is still not quite set right. Okay? And then the final term we're going to look at is the term demon. And this is a fun one because, depending on your culture and how you grew up and how you heard people around you talk, this has all kinds of like weird visual connotations, right? But the word demon, it was a Greek term, and it was in use several centuries before the New Testament of the Bible was written. And originally in Greek, it referred to either a Greek god, like a major Greek god, and then eventually it came to represent a lesser Greek god, or what we might call a demigod as well, like people that were half god, half human. In some of the Greek myths, if you watch Moana today, kind of like a Maui figure who has some supernatural powers, right? And then also could represent in Greek another supernatural source of power, like a supernatural power source. And then if you think about how Jewish people used the word demon, what they thought of, they were thinking some kind of a created and empowered spiritual being, so not a being in flesh, but a spiritual being, think of an invisible one perhaps, specifically one that was intent on stealing God's honor or causing some form of harm to people. So that was a demon in the Greek mindset, or in the Jewish mindset. And so when we look at Paul using that word, we need to keep in mind how the Greek people in the audience perceive that, and also how some of the Jewish people in the church in Corinth would have seen that. But it's a supernatural being of some sort, normally not focused on good things, good intent. So as we get into this, we're going to take a look again at 3 final pieces of advice that Paul gives the Corinthians to help them read the room, the situation that they're in, and decide whether or not to exercise or restrict their freedoms in the moment. And the advice that Paul gives to the Corinthians is advice that can benefit us as well. So let's go ahead and jump in this morning. Sorry, I forgot that I put those on the slides this morning. First thing we want to do is consider parallels. And again, these are things in our mind, like in the room, in the moment, so we're not going to flip through a Bible necessarily, but part of our mental exercise is going to be, like Paul urged the Corinthians, to think, is there anything in my situation that's parallel to something that I've read about in Scripture, in the Bible? Does the Bible ever speak about a similar situation? And just to get into the Corinthians' situation in the moment, these last 3 chapters, 2 chapters and chapter 10 today, have been about Paul's advice to some people in the church of Corinth who are getting annoyed with other people in the church of Corinth, who don't feel the same freedom that they do to attend some of the community feasts that are held following sacrifices to different Greek and Roman gods in the 9 or so pagan temples that are in town. So they're annoyed because they look at this and they say, those gods, those idols, they're not real gods. We worship the real God. Why can't you just go to a feast without having a conscience that's harmed by that? Okay? They're annoyed. And Paul's saying, think about, as you exercise or want to exercise this freedom to attend these meals following these temple sacrifices, well, let's look at a few things to help you make a better, more informed decision. First of all, does the Bible speak about any similar situations? And lo and behold, it actually does. Back in Exodus 32, second book in the Bible, there are some ancient Israelites, and they're devoted to the God of Israel. They've just actually committed to following the God of Israel with their lives. And they attend this feast that follows sacrifices. In this case, it's to an idol. It's a statue, a gold statue of a cow, of a calf. And this is how it turns out. That feast, again, these idol feasts aren't always really, integrity-filled events. And so in that case, the feast ended in drunkenness and reckless sexual behavior that ended up destroying thousands of people's lives. And so Paul's saying, think about how attending some of these idol feasts might work out for you. This is what he says in Scripture. We're going to read through 1 Corinthians 10 this morning. I didn't put all the lyrics or all the words up there, but if you want to follow along in your Bibles or on your phones, you're welcome to. If you just want to sit back and listen, that's great as well. This is chapter 10, the start of it. Paul writes, "Now I don't want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, church in Corinth, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." He's speaking about the Jewish ancestors or ancestors in their faith who left Egypt, walked through the parted Red Sea, if you've read that part of the Bible, and he calls that baptism. He's making some parallels because that people, Israel in the Old Testament, in the early Old Testament, they had chosen to follow this God, the God of the Bible who revealed himself to them. He says they all ate the same spiritual food. They all drank the same spiritual drink. They drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. There's a lot of imagery in there, and I don't have time to unpack it all in detail for you. But essentially, Paul is highlighting some of the major events that happened to make the point that these people, they were pursuing God. They shared the same spiritual beliefs, right? They were in this together. They were in the same community of faith, just like the Corinthians are in a community of faith that's centered around the God of the Bible. They're committed. But Paul says in verse 5, "Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them since they were struck down in the wilderness." So just because you're a part of a committed community of people that want to follow God doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to act in ways that please God. Israel did not, if you read the story and the history. He says, "Now these things took place as examples for us so that we will not desire evil things as they did. Don't become idol worshippers as some of them were, as it's written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to party." And that word translated party, it implies laughter that results from drunkenness and seduction. Okay, seductive behaviors. It's a little more than throwing a party, right? He says, "Let us not commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in a single day 23,000 people died." So again, he's recounting that example that I just described a moment ago that you see up on the screens. How very devoted people can make some choices related to especially worship of other gods in this situation that lead them to some moral compromises. So as the Corinthians are just so confident in their situation and their spirituality, he's saying, be careful, because I know that these Roman and Greek idol feasts don't always end well. And some of the same things that happened to Israel with drunkenness and seduction and immoral choices, they happen in these banquets in town as well. So just realize that. Another thing is, the ancient Israelites, looking back to their example that Paul's pointing them to, considering the parallels, they also felt free to complain and underestimated their own vulnerability to temptation a lot. If you read some of those same stories of Israel wandering around in the desert, the Sinai desert, for 40 years, you see over and over again they're complaining. And over and over again they think that they're so invincible to temptation, and they fall over and over again. And Paul's saying, I think that's how some of you are perceiving your ability to use your own freedom. You feel so free, but you don't know that you're kind of vulnerable people. And you're also complaining about this group of people in the church that doesn't feel the same. In fact, the words in chapter 10 that we're focused on that tell us this point, start in verse 9. Paul writes, "Let us not test Christ as some of them did and were destroyed by snakes, and don't grumble as some of the ancient Israelites did and were killed by the destroyer. These things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our instruction, on whom the ends of the ages have come." There's that phrase. So on whom the ends of the ages have arrived. In other words, God has stepped down into history now in the person of Jesus and has started to begin to set some things in the world right. Things are progressing toward God's plan to one day completely set the world right. And so shouldn't your lives reflect that goal of God that's stepping into history at this moment in ancient Corinth and is still in history in our our moment right now as well, working out these ends. He says, "So whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall." So don't be too overconfident in your spirituality. Don't think that you're too invincible when it comes to certain temptations. He's just saying be cautious because you saw how all this played out based on other examples in the Bible throughout history. So don't be overconfident in your situation as you exercise this freedom. He also makes another point as well, and it's not on the notes, but one way out of temptation. He's going to address this in verses 13, 14, and 15 of 1 Corinthians 10. One way out of temptation for Israel in the Old Testament, and also for the Corinthians at the time of this letter, and then to us 2,000 years later, is to restrict our personal freedoms by avoiding situations that common sense says might trip us up. Sometimes you have that internal voice that's like, you really shouldn't do that. That's common sense kind of, or our conscience, or maybe sometimes the Holy Spirit at work in our lives. But Paul appeals to common sense. Verses 13 to 15, he says, "No temptation has come upon you except what's common to humanity." So, there's nothing new. That's why you can read about examples earlier in the Bible and you see people struggling with the same thing 3,000 years ago that you struggle with today. "But God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way out so you may be able to bear it." And in Christian circles, sometimes we talk about, ways out of temptation and God always giving you an out. But that verse, it's in this specific context. He says, "So then, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. I'm speaking as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I am saying." So the context of his advice that, God will give you a way out of temptation is actually that way out is using your common sense and choosing not to exercise freedoms that, too much freedom to the point that it's going to trip you up. It's having that wisdom to know how free is too free and where to draw the lines. So that's one thing we can do in the moment when we're trying to figure out, is this exercising too much freedom, taking this liberty in life, or not? Are there parallels in the Bible? Another thing we can consider is our participation. Will my loyalty to Jesus be overshadowed or questioned if I participate in this specific thing? And again, this is a kind of a very specific circumstance that they're dealing with. So in their circumstance, it's religious activities. And so on one hand, the purpose of certain religious activities and spiritual practices, if you participate in them, and again, they're participating in meals following sacrifices in Greek and Roman temples to different gods or goddesses, okay? But the purpose of some certain religious activities and spiritual practices is to affirm a community's loyalty to a deity or a force or a power. And that's kind of vague, so Paul's going to give us some examples. And those examples involve Christians, Jewish people, and Romans, okay? For example, we do something about once a month here at Mountain View. We take these trays and we have little cups with grape juice, and we have another cup that has a piece of bread. We pass it around and we each drink the drink and eat the bread. Why do we do that? Well, at a very simple level, what we're doing is we're affirming our loyalty and faith in Jesus Christ and his death on the cross for our sins that can provide us with forgiveness, a restored relationship with God, the ability to begin to see life from God's perspective, transforms us, reconnects us with God, and starts to reconnect us with other people, right? That's what we're doing. We're saying as we all drink this together, we're unified in this faith, right? We affirm our faith together as a community. And then the Jewish people, oftentimes, they would share a special meal after they made sacrifices in the temple in ancient Jerusalem. They'd make the sacrifices, they'd share a meal together, and that was symbolic of all of them affirming their faith in the God of the Bible. And then also, Greeks and Romans, they would have these meals after sacrifices. And that's what some of the Corinthian church members were saying. We should be completely free to attend those. Like it's a public banquet, it's a social event. We can make connections there. But a lot of the Greek and Roman people, they were eating those meals to affirm their loyalty to whatever spiritual being happened to be represented by the idol or the statue at that temple. Because in a Greek and a Roman person's mind, sometimes we look at people, ancient peoples worshiping statues, and we're like, how stupid could people be? It was a rock or a piece of wood. But in an ancient person's mind, it wasn't just a rock or a piece of wood. It was a rock or a piece of wood that represented a real deity, a real spiritual being or force that was in control of a certain aspect of the environment or of health or prosperity or something, or of war. And so they weren't just worshiping something that was a statue. They were worshiping what that statue represented. And so as they ate this meal, they were affirming their faith in and allegiance to this being that had control over this certain aspect of their world or environment. So it was more than that. And so in the next several verses, from verse 12 up through verse 20, without going into detail, Paul is just recounting that. He's saying, in the Christian experience with communion or the Eucharist or Lord's Supper, however you term it, the Jewish experience with the meals following sacrifices, and the Greek and Roman experiences with their meals following their sacrifices, it's more than just a meal. There is actually a community loyalty that's being expressed. And so as we consider what's happening, that's one of the things that we need to consider. If we participate in some religious activity, it's not maybe our religious activity, but we're participating in it for whatever reason, or it's some kind of spiritual practice, is it done in such a way or in such a context where it will seem like we are actually affirming our loyalty to that different deity or different force or different power? And that's something that only we can kind of assess in the moment, right? These are just questions for us. It's not giving us a definitive answer. But will my loyalty to Jesus be overshadowed or questioned if I participate in this thing in the moment? And it's very specific because it's in the context of involvement with other religious activity beyond the worship of the God of the Bible. Another thing here, according to the Bible, it's actually possible for our participation in other forms of religion or spirituality that rely on higher powers, which from a Bible standpoint doesn't just involve some fake imaginary higher power, but there is some reality behind that, because the Bible affirms the existence of actual spiritual beings that are behind some of this. Would my involvement with that cause God to feel cheated on? Your Bibles say the word jealous, but it essentially means, like you're cheating on him in favor of some other god or deity or power. That's another angle to look at it. In fact, Paul uses some pretty strong language. This is in verses 20, 21, and 22 in 1 Corinthians 10. He says, I don't want you to be participants with demons. Again, not this like dark black figure that you see at Halloween represented with creepy things, but some other spiritual force or power that's been created and empowered and maybe is working to receive honor or direct honor away from God, and maybe even is working toward harmful ends. But he's saying, I don't want you to participate with that. And Paul believes that participating in worship at Greek and Roman temples, that these spiritual beings that these idol statues actually represent, he thinks that they are actual spiritual beings that exist, that have certain powers, but maybe are trying to steal the glory away from God in that process. That's how Paul sees this. He says, I don't want you to unknowingly participate with these other spiritual powers and provoke God to jealousy. He says you can't drink of the cup of the Lord and of the cup of demons. You can't come to church and drink this juice and this bread, break this bread that represents your loyalty to Jesus, and then go to these feasts at the temple and consume them because everybody around you thinks that you're pledging your loyalty to that god or that goddess. They don't know that you're just feeling free in your heart. He says, or are we provoking the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he is? And so again, these are personal considerations that we have to weigh in our own hearts. But will my participation in whatever is before me cause my loyalty to Jesus to be questioned or just overshadowed because people think I'm more about some other religion or more about some other spiritual practice? And Jesus, he's not really in my life or that important to me. It's this other spiritual area of life that I put my focus in and on. The last question that Paul would have us consider, I think, and has the Corinthians consider in these types of situations as we're reading the room is, what will be most beneficial to the people around me? And this is something that he's come back to over and over again throughout chapters 8, 9, and 10. And so Paul's going to give the Corinthians a few pieces of advice as they consider what's most beneficial to people around them. And there's a lot of angles, and that's really helpful for us. And some of this is review. But first, Paul's going to encourage the Corinthians to exercise freedom in their private lives. So as they're going to the market and they're making their purchases and they're preparing their meals in their homes, exercise freedom in their private lives and in their personal reactions with people who have similar ideas about what's good and bad, similar convictions, okay? When you're with people who feel similarly and think similarly, it's okay to exercise the freedoms that you feel you have. But there also might be times where you're with someone who feels more freedom than you even feel. And so in those moments, exercise grace in the presence of people who hold different convictions. For example, a long time ago, my wife, when she was in college, she went to Italy over the Christmas season. She was a part of a Christian college, and they took a team of singers over to sing Christmas carols in Italy. And they did this in conjunction with different churches. They would go out into the Christmas markets that exist, and they would sing some carols, and they were dressed up like Victorian-era Charles Dickens characters, and so this drew a lot of attention, right? You have Charles Dickens and, friends walking through the streets in Italy in the Christmas markets, singing these Christmas carols, and people, of course, were drawn into that. And some of the local pastors would use that as an opportunity to invite people into Christmas Eve service or, some sort of Christmas-oriented church service in the area. So they were kind of like the publicity and the PR people. And this Christian school was pretty conservative. And so drinking alcohol was not in line with the school's kind of perception of how Christians should act. However, in Italy, drinking wine is very common with meals. And so this team of people found themselves in people's homes where they're being invited in, food is set before them, and a glass of wine is set before them at the meals because that's what's culturally appropriate, regardless of what your religious affiliation is in Italy. And it's been that way for thousands of years. And so in those moments, they had to exercise grace and maybe either just not say anything if it violated their convictions, or just feel the freedom to have a glass of wine in that moment, even though it wasn't necessarily in line with the way that they viewed Christianity or their school did at the time. So it created that, that decision in the moment. But part of it was weighing the people around them, right? And showing grace and not being judgmental, right? Because it's a totally different culture. And either just politely, not drinking or perhaps even sharing with them in that moment to consider their culture. And that's essentially what Paul is talking about in verses 23 through 27 or so. He says, everything is permissible. It's in quotes in some translations because Paul's probably referring back to a letter the Corinthians wrote to him before his letter to them, where this group of people who felt all these freedoms was saying, everything's okay. It's all permissible. And Paul counters, he says, but not everything's beneficial. They say everything is permissible. He says, but not everything builds up the people around you. No one seeks his own good, but the good of the other person. Then he says, eat everything that's sold in the meat market without raising questions for the sake of conscience. So when you're out doing your private shopping and eating your meals, don't be concerned about whether the meat that was in the meat market was offered at some kind of a sacrifice at a pagan temple down the street. If you want to purchase that item and eat it and consume it, you just do it. Don't think too much about that. He says, since the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. And that's a bigger reality that he focused on in chapter 8 as well. He says, if any of the unbelievers invites you over and you want to go, eat everything that's set before you without raising questions for the sake of conscience. And somebody who's outside the faith, it could be a Jewish person who sets kosher food before them. It could be somebody who worships Greek or Roman gods or goddesses, who sets meat before them that was sacrificed at a temple, or who sets a lot of wine before them. And so in those events, Paul says, you can eat whatever is set before you. If you have a personal conviction, it doesn't mean that you have to, but you can feel the freedom if you already feel the freedom to do that anyway. You don't have to pretend to, subscribe to some sort of specific Christian action, around them to show them how moral you are in the moment. If that's something where your convictions aren't violated and you feel like you have the freedom, it's okay in the moment. Or in the situation, be aware that you might have to extend grace because they might feel even more freedoms to eat and drink certain things than you do. And so again, navigate it with understanding in the moment. Next, Paul advises the Corinthians to restrict their freedoms if they know that exercising them will distress or tempt someone else in the moment. Okay? And the question is, well, how do you know if you're going to distress or tempt somebody else? And in this situation, Paul's saying, well, they're going to tell you about it. If somebody makes a comment to you and says, well, I just don't feel comfortable with that, and you do, maybe that's the moment to kind of hold back as well, because you know that if you participate in something that other people are in the moment, you're going to make friend A over here uncomfortable because they just told you so, right? He says, if somebody says to you, again in their context, this food's from a sacrifice, don't eat it. He says, don't eat it out of consideration for the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. He says, I don't mean your own conscience because you don't have that conviction, but for the other person's. If you can tell it's going to distress that person next to you because they told you so, again, what's the main question? What's going to be most beneficial to the people around me, right? So be considerate. Another thing is, Paul doesn't tell the Corinthians to restrict their freedoms to appease other Christians who are attempting to police their morality. And that's important too, because this is somebody who's genuinely convicted in their own conscience. Not just another believer who's in the room who's saying, Christians don't act like this. They don't do those things. And they don't really they're not being affected. They're not being tempted by anything. They are trying to force their convictions on other Christians in the room. And Paul speaks to that. He says in verse 29 and 30, why is my freedom judged by another person's conscience? So we're not taking our conscience and forcing other people to live by our conscience. We're not judging each other's freedom. He says, if I partake in something with thanksgiving, something he feels free to do, why am I criticized because of something for which I give thanks, right? If I can do this and be thankful to the Lord for it, why should another person look at me and judge me for being thankful to God? Why should they impose their convictions on me? He says, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about somebody in the room who's genuinely distressed. They're not trying to make me do anything. They're just making a comment about what they're seeing maybe a group do or other people in the room do, right? They're not focused on me. They're just commenting on the situation and saying, oh, I'm just not comfortable with that. And if you hear that kind of a remark, maybe it's good for you to also in that moment just hold back and exercise restraint to help that person that's distressed feel more comfortable in the moment, be more concerned about them and their feelings. Lastly, Paul reminds the Corinthians to consider God's best interests as well, because the people around you includes God. He's not a human person, but he's a person, right? He has thoughts and feelings and emotions and plans and a bigger plan than you'll ever realize, He says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, so it's not just about eating or drinking, it's about all these circumstances we find ourselves in life. Do everything for the glory of God. Glory just means honor, kind of at its basic level. And so what will be honoring to God in this moment? He says, give no offense to Jews or Greeks or the church of God, And in offense, he's talking about things that are going to push people away from growth. So if somebody is a Greek or a Jew and they're investigating Jesus, and we exercise too much freedom in a way that causes them to say, well, I'm not interested in that Christianity thing anymore. And that's too much in the moment for those people. Or if it's a newer believer who's still, a little bit trying to get a handle on things, and we do something that's too free for them because they came from a different, maybe religious belief or non-religious belief in the past, it's too much in the moment for them. We have to be considerate of that as well if we're aware of that. He says, just as I also try to please everyone in everything, not seeking my own benefit, but the benefit of many, so that they may be saved. So Paul's ultimate thought is, will this lead somebody closer to Jesus or help them come to see a need to be rescued by Jesus if they haven't yet, to come into a relationship with God, into an understanding and a reliance on him if they haven't yet. And so there are bigger pictures, bigger questions, and that has to do with what God's working out in the situation in the people's lives too, not just about the people around us and how they're reacting in the moment. So here's a quick summary. Again, how do we read the room and decide whether or not to exercise or restrict our freedoms in the moment? We can ask 3 questions. 1, does the Bible speak about a similar situation? And that's why it's important to become more familiar with the Bible and God in the Bible and people's choices in the Bible and how that works out. The more familiar we are with things in the moment, maybe those things will pop into our mind and we'll have examples. If we're newer in our faith, our catalog of examples is going to be pretty small. But as we grow in our faith and we get more experience and exposure to the Bible, we're going to have a bigger catalog, and in the moment, we'll be able to make better decisions as we encounter these circumstances. Secondly, will my loyalty to Jesus be overshadowed or questioned? Maybe some of the opportunities we have are religious in nature or spiritual in nature to be involved with things. And we have so many friends in our lives who I would say are spiritual people, but are not followers of Jesus or the God of the Bible. And so as we interact, as we do things with them, do they still know that our allegiance lies with Jesus? Or are we overstepping things and participating in things that cause them to think, they're just a seeker of spirituality like I am, Jesus isn't any more important than anything else. And only we can decide that in the moment. And if you have friends who follow different religious faiths or follow different forms of spirituality, only you can gauge that in the moment. And thirdly, lastly, what will be the most beneficial to the people around me? Sometimes it's going to be to hold back and say, even though I feel the freedom to do this or be this way or dress this way or entertain myself this way, I know that somebody else around me, it's going to make them feel distressed. So I'm going to hold back. And then other times we'll realize because maybe I'm just with my family or I'm with people who have similar convictions, it's okay to be a little more free in certain situations. But those questions help guide us in the moment.